It's amazing to me how much more specialized tech keeps getting.
Yeah,
Like, you start reading about something like semiconductors, right? The brains of pretty much all our gadgets these days.
right,
And all of a sudden, you're down this rabbit hole of complexity.
right.
Like, all these different companies and materials and technologies. It's like, whoa.
Yeah, it really is a lot to keep track of, even for people in the industry. The level of detail is pretty remarkable.
It makes you realize that to understand the moves these companies are making, you got to go deeper.
Exactly. Way deeper than just the headlines.
And, well, that's exactly what we're going to try and do today.
Right.
We're going to take a deep dive into something that happened a couple years back now, but still has a lot of people talking.
Okay.
Back in 2022, Intel announced they were going to be buying Tower Semiconductor. $5.4 billion
Yeah.
cash,
Yeah, that was a big one. Definitely raised some eyebrows.
for sure. I mean, it was a pretty clear sign about where Intel was wanting to go. So, for everyone listening, in this deep dive, we're going to try to figure out just what Intel was thinking with this move, what it means for the whole semiconductor industry, and why you should care even if you aren't some chip designer.
Good plan.
And we're basing this whole thing off a really interesting article that analyzes the acquisition. So, why did Intel decide to shell out billions for this other company? What was so special about Tower?
So, the main reason boils down to Intel wanting to get bigger in something called Foundry services.
Okay.
So, think of it like this. You've got designers creating clothes, right?
Sure.
And then you've got the factories where those clothes are made. These foundry services are basically the factories, but for chips. Companies design the chips, but they don't always have these massive factories, or fabs as they're called, to actually make them.
Gotcha.
So they turn to these foundry companies.
So Intel, a company that's always been known for making their own chips, suddenly wants to start making chips that other companies designed.
Exactly. They saw this opening, this whole foundry business, and decided to go after it, trying to become like TSMC and Samsung Foundry, the big players right now.
I see.
And a big reason they're doing this is because there's this huge demand for something called specialty chips.
Specialty chips, what are those?
Yeah.
It's kind of vague.
It does, right? But they're actually super important. Our source mentions things like analog semiconductors, power management chips, RF components. That stands for radio frequency.
Okay.
It's not your typical super powerful processors like in computers or phones. Instead, these are kind of like the building blocks for a ton of other technologies. They're more specialized, hence the name.
Okay, starting to get it.
Mhm.
But where do we actually see these specialty chips?
Oh, all over the place. Like, think about your car
Okay.
sensors, the system that manages all the power, all the stuff that lets it connect to your phone, all that relies on these kinds of chips. Then you've got the whole Internet of Things, all those smart devices, medical equipment that's getting more and more advanced. Even the stuff that makes our wireless networks work. It all needs these analog, power, and RF chips. And all these areas are growing like crazy.
That makes sense. So Tower, the company Intel bought, they were good at making these kinds of chips.
Yeah, that was their specialty, which made them a really attractive target for Intel.
So Intel saw this huge need for specialty chips and realized, hey, we need to get in on this.
Yeah, they wanted to be a part of that whole foundry market and go head-to-head with TSMC and Samsung.
Makes sense. But before we go any further, can we back up just a bit?
Sure.
You mentioned Intel Foundry Services, IFS, which is their contract manufacturing division.
Yeah.
Our source also pointed out that TSMC and Samsung are already huge in this space. They make chips for companies like Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, the giants.
Absolutely. They're the leaders right now.
So it seems like Intel buying Tower wasn't just about getting bigger, it was also about becoming more, well, specialized.
Exactly. It was about filling a specific gap in their offerings.
Right. I mean, Intel was known for PC chips, data center chips, that sort of thing. But this was them branching out, recognizing that the whole semiconductor world was changing.
Exactly. You got to adapt to stay on top.
So they saw this demand for specialty chips, this growing foundry business, and decided to jump in head first.
And they didn't just wake up one morning and decide to buy Tower.
Right.
They did their research. Tons of it.
Okay, so what did this research tell them? What were the big trends they saw?
Well, one big trend was the whole shift towards using foundry services in the first place.
Okay.
Companies are realizing it's better to focus on designing chips and then have someone else worry about the manufacturing.
That makes sense.
It's expensive and complicated to do that yourself. And the research showed that foundries like TSMC, GlobalFoundries, UMC, they were doing really well. Lots of orders, lots of revenue, especially in the specialty chip area.
It was like a signal, a market signal telling Intel, hey, this is where things are going.
Exactly. And it probably showed Intel that buying a company like Tower, a company that already knew how to do this stuff, was a lot faster than trying to build everything from scratch.
Yeah, like way less risky too. Okay, so that's one trend. What else did the research show?
The other big trend was the one we already talked about, the exploding demand for analog and specialty chips.
Right.
All those sectors we mentioned before, automotive, telecom, industrial, they were all projected to grow a ton. And Tower, they already had customers in those areas.
So Intel could jump right in, no waiting.
Exactly. Instant access to these new markets.
I'd imagine the global situation was a factor too, right? All the talk about secure supply chains, wanting to make things domestically.
Yeah, definitely. Geopolitical stuff played a role for sure. Everyone wants a more stable supply chain, especially for something as important as semiconductors. And Tower was a US-based company, so that helped with the whole domestic manufacturing push. The research probably showed Intel the risks of relying too much on global supply chains.
Okay, so Tower was a U.S. company. They already had factories. They knew how to make these in-demand specialty chips. But they must have had something else going for them, right? Some specific tech that Intel wanted.
Oh, yeah, they had some special sauce for sure. They were really good at making a few specific types of semiconductors. Our source mentions SIG, that's silicon germanium,
Okay.
PMOS, and MEMS, which stands for microelectromechanical systems.
Those are a mouthful.
They are. But basically, these technologies let you make a much wider range of chips than just your typical digital ones. Like SIG is really good for things that need to work at high frequencies, which is important for wireless communication.
Interesting.
So Intel basically absorbed all this expertise when they bought Tower. It was a way to boost their own manufacturing capabilities.
And if I remember right, Tower also had existing customers in those high-growth areas we talked about.
They did, yeah. Strong relationships in the automotive, industrial, and telecom sectors, that was a big plus for Intel. Gave them a way to reach customers outside their usual markets, the PC and data center folks.
So Intel got the tech, the expertise, the customers. Sounds like a smart move. But how did they actually make it all work? How do you merge two companies like that?
So according to the article, they focused on three main things: integrating the technology, growing the customer base, and finding ways to make the two companies work better together. Basically, trying to get the best of both worlds.
Sounds challenging.
Oh, it was. There were definitely some bumps along the way. The source talks about regulatory hurdles, for example.
What kind of hurdles?
Well, when a deal this big happens in such an important industry, governments want to take a close look, make sure everything's on the up and up, and that took time, which slowed things down a bit.
Yeah, makes sense. Government's got to be careful with something as vital as semiconductors. What other challenges did they face?
Well, competition was still fierce.
Right.
TSMC and Samsung weren't just going to roll over. Intel had to prove they could make chips just as well, for a good price, and be reliable. That takes time to build that kind of trust, especially when customers were already used to working with the other big players.
I see.
Plus, the whole global supply chain was still messed up back then, so that added another layer of complexity to the whole thing, like trying to put together a puzzle while the pieces are still moving around.
Sounds like a real headache. So what's the plan going forward? Where's Intel's foundry business headed now that they've got Tower in the mix?
So their big focus is on scaling up, becoming a true foundry powerhouse. That means increasing production, investing in new tech, and winning over new customers. Tower's expertise in those analog and specialty chips is a big part of that strategy.
Makes sense.
They also want to keep pushing the boundaries of chip making in general. Things like advanced packaging, high-performance designs areas where Tower's tech gives them an edge. And of course, they're also working on partnerships, teaming up with chip designers, car companies, telecom companies, basically anyone who needs those specialty chips that Tower was so good at making.
Okay, so let me try to sum all this up for our listeners.
Go for it.
Intel buying Tower was a big deal, and not just because it was a lot of money.
Right.
It was a strategic move. It was Intel saying, we see where the future of tech is going, and we're going to be part of it.
Exactly. Recognizing that specialized chips are becoming more and more important in all sorts of areas.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating is that even though this is all happening kind of behind the scenes, it affects all of us.
Oh, absolutely.
These tiny chips are in everything: cars, phones, the internet itself. So what Intel does with its foundry business, well, that matters. It's going to shape the tech we use every day.
It's all connected. What happens at the fundamental level ripples outward.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. If specialized tech is so important, What other surprising moves might we see in the semiconductor world? What other seemingly small or niche areas might become the next big thing? Definitely something to keep an eye on.
I agree. The future of tech is full of surprises.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll catch you next time.
Take care.